Breaking news from the industrial district of Chicago. Federal agents have just breached the central logistics hub of the St. James Foundation, one of the world's most respected charities.
The warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago covered 4 city blocks. To the public, it was the beating heart of the St. James Foundation, a place where tons of rice, medicine, and clothing were sorted daily to be sent to war zones and disaster areas. The logo of the foundation, a pair of white hands cradling a dove, was painted on the roof, visible from space. But at 4:02 a.m. on a freezing Thursday in February, the only thing being distributed at the facility was federal justice. 74 heavily armed agents from the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force cut through the chain-link fence. They didn't use sirens. They used thermal cutters and battering rams. The target wasn't a cartel boss or a gang leader. The warrant bore the name of a woman who had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times, Madeleine St. James. Madeleine, at 68 years old, was known as the Saint of Chicago. She was the grandmother everyone wished they had. Soft-spoken, always wearing modest gray suits, she had built a $400 million nonprofit empire on the premise of sending young American volunteers to heal the world. Her annual gala was attended by senators, Hollywood stars, and religious leaders. She was currently inside the warehouse executive suite, preparing for a morning flight to Geneva to speak at the UN about human rights. When Special Agent David Miller kicked open the door to her office, Madeleine didn't scream. She was drinking herbal tea and reviewing a spreadsheet. She looked up over her reading glasses, her face a picture of confused innocence. "Is there a fire, officer?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We have baby formula in Sector 4 that needs to be protected." Agent Miller, a man who had spent 20 years hunting monsters, wasn't fooled by the grandmother act. He walked over to her desk and unplugged her computer. "The only fire, Miss St. James," Miller said cold, "is the one you're going to burn in. You're under arrest for kidnapping, slavery, and fraud." "You're making a terrible mistake," Madeleine whispered, clutching her pearl necklace. "My volunteers are in Cambodia. They are in Peru. They are doing God's work." "No, Madeleine," Miller replied. "We know they never left the building." The arrest of Madeleine St. James was just the beginning. The real horror lay beneath the concrete floor of the sorting facility. The warehouse was officially listed as a logistics and storage center. But the blueprints Agent Miller had obtained from a whistleblower showed a discrepancy. The building's footprint was 20% larger than its interior dimensions. There was a dead zone in the center of the structure, surrounded by walls of stacked pallets reaching 30 feet high. The investigation that led to this raid was one of the strangest in Bureau history. It hadn't started with a missing person report. The parents of the volunteers thought their children were safe. They received weekly emails from them, complete with photos of them digging wells in Africa or teaching English in Asia. The investigation started with a pair of sneakers. 6 months earlier, a homeless man in Detroit had found a pair of brand-new high-end running shoes in a dumpster behind a Salvation Army. Tucked inside the sole of the left shoe was a tiny scrap of cardboard. On it, written in what looked like blood or rust, was a message. "Help. We are not in Africa. We are in the box. Chicago. Warehouse." 4. Lisa. The homeless man took the note to the police. Most cops would have thrown it away. But the desk sergeant had a niece named Lisa who had joined the St. James Foundation 2 years ago and moved to Kenya. He called the FBI. Agent Miller took the case. He began tracking the IP addresses of the emails sent by the volunteers. They were sophisticated. They were routed through VPNs in Nairobi, Lima, and Bangkok. But Miller noticed a pattern. The photos attached to the emails, smiling young people posing with local children, all had subtle digital anomalies. The shadows didn't match the time of day. The African dust on their clothes looked like Photoshop noise. And when he analyzed the background of a video call from Peru, He saw a reflection in a window. It wasn't the Andes Mountains. It was a row of industrial shelving units with a barcode that belonged to a specific logistics company in Illinois. Miller realized the terrifying truth. The St. James Foundation wasn't sending volunteers overseas. They were recruiting them, bringing them to Chicago for training, and then vanishing them into a black hole. The mission trips were a lie. The emails were faked. The photos were staged in a studio. Back at the warehouse, the tactical teams were moving toward the dead zone. The entrance was hidden behind a massive industrial compactor used for crushing cardboard boxes. When agents disabled the hydraulics and moved the machine, they found a steel door equipped with a biometric lock. "Blow it," Miller ordered. The explosion shook the dust from the rafters. As the smoke cleared, the agents turned on their tactical lights and stepped inside. They expected a dungeon. What they found looked like an Amazon fulfillment center from hell. The hidden section of the warehouse was a vast, windowless factory floor. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and unwashed bodies. And there, in the center of the room, were the cages. They weren't traditional jail cells. They were modified shipping containers, stacked too high, with bars welded over the open ends. Inside the containers were rows of bunk beds, and inside the beds were the volunteers. 80 young men and women. They were gaunt, pale, their skin gray from lack of sunlight. They wore matching beige jumpsuits with the Foundation's logo, the hands cradling the dove, stamped on the back. When the agents burst in, shouting, "FBI, you are safe!" nobody cheered. Nobody ran. They just sat there, staring with dead eyes. They were terrified. They had been conditioned to believe that the outside world was dangerous, that they had signed contracts giving their lives to the cause, and that if they tried to leave, their families would be harmed. "Secure the perimeter!" Miller shouted, his voice cracking as he saw the scale of the atrocity. "Get paramedics in here! Everyone needs a checkup!" Miller walked to the nearest container. A young woman was sitting on the floor, sewing a patch onto a designer handbag. She didn't look up. Her fingers were bleeding. "Lisa?" Miller asked softly, looking at the photo in his file. The girl stopped sewing. She looked up slowly. She was 22, but she looked 40. Her eyes were hollow. "Did the quota go up?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can finish the batch. Please don't put me in the quiet room." "No quota," Miller said, unlocking the cage door. "The factory is closed, Lisa. Forever." As the agents began to cut the locks on the 40 containers, the reality of Madeleine St. James's operation became clear. This wasn't just a kidnapping ring. It was a slave labor camp hiding in plain sight. The volunteers weren't building schools. They were manufacturing counterfeit luxury goods, handbags, shoes, watches, that the Foundation sold on the black market to fund Madeleine's lavish lifestyle and political bribes. She had taken America's most idealistic youth, the ones who wanted to save the world, and turned them into machines. But as Miller helped Lisa out of the cage, he noticed something else. At the far end of the warehouse, past the containers, was a glass-walled office that overlooked the factory floor. Inside, a red light was blinking on a server rack. Someone was watching. Someone was deleting the archives. Madeleine wasn't just the CEO. She had partners, and right now, they were trying to erase the evidence of 10 years of slavery. "Get to the server room," Miller yelled into his radio. "Don't let them wipe the drives." The raid was over, but the unraveling of the Saints' web was just beginning. Agent Miller tackled the IT administrator just as his finger hovered over the execute key. The screen was flashing red. Formatting drive C. 85% complete. "Cancel it!" Miller screamed, pressing his service weapon to the tech's temple. "Stop the wipe, or you go down for 80 counts of conspiracy to commit kidnapping." The tech, a pale man named Gary seeking a plea deal before he was even handcuffed, typed the abort code. The red bar stopped. The data was saved. What Miller found on those drives was the blueprint of a deception so sophisticated it made standard fraud look like child's play. The St. James Foundation wasn't just a sweatshop. It was a digital theater production designed to fool the world. The folder labeled the Ambassadors Program revealed the recruitment process. It targeted a specific demographic: wealthy, idealistic, college-educated youth, the kind of young people who wanted to take a gap year to save the world. Madeleine St. James didn't kidnap them off the street. She lured them in with brochures printed on recycled paper, promising transformative experiences, building schools in Kenya, digging wells in Cambodia, and teaching in rural Peru. Families paid $15,000 for the privilege of sending their children into Madeleine's care. The process was methodical. Step 1. The orientation. Volunteers arrived at a luxury hotel in Chicago for a week of training. They were told to hand over their passports for visa processing and their personal phones for security reasons in unstable regions. They were given Foundation-issued tablets instead, tablets that were hardwired to monitor every keystroke. Step 2. The departure. At 3 a.m., groggy and excited, the volunteers were loaded into windowless vans they were told were armored transports, taking them to a private airfield. They were driven in circles for 2 hours to disorient them. When the doors opened, they weren't on a tarmac. They were inside the warehouse's dead zone, and the first thing they saw wasn't a plane. It was armed guards with tasers and the smiling face of Madeleine St. James, who told them the rules had changed. "You are here to work," she told them. "If you work, your families will receive letters. They will receive photos. They will know you are happy. If you refuse, the letters stop, and your parents will spend the rest of their lives wondering which ditch you are rotting in." It was the ultimate psychological leverage. These kids didn't fear dying. They feared breaking their parents' hearts. But the most chilling discovery on the server was the folder named The Studio. Agent Miller clicked on a video file. It showed Lisa, the girl he had just rescued. She was wearing a khaki vest and a sun hat. She was holding a shovel. Behind her was a lush green jungle and a village of thatched huts. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad," Lisa said in the video, her smile bright but her eyes terrified. "We just finished the foundation for the school. It's so hot here in Nairobi, but I love it. I miss you." Miller paused the video. He zoomed out. The jungle was a high-resolution printed backdrop. The sunlight was a studio rig. The dirt on her face was makeup applied by a stylist who was also a prisoner. The warehouse contained 3 soundproof stages, one for Africa, one for South America, one for Southeast Asia. Every Sunday was media day. The prisoners were taken from their cages, washed, dressed in costumes, and forced to record these updates. Madeleine employed a team of video editors who added ambient sounds, birds, wind, foreign languages, to make the clips convincing. They used VPNs to route the emails through servers in the alleged host countries. For 3 years, Lisa's parents in Ohio thought she was saving lives in Kenya. In reality, she was 20 feet underground in Chicago, stitching counterfeit Gucci bags for 16 hours a day. The quota was the engine of the operation. The digital ledger showed that the St. James Foundation had contracts with underground distributors in New York, Los Angeles, and London. They sold super fakes, counterfeit luxury goods so high quality that even experts struggled to tell them apart. Why were they so good? Because they were made by intelligent, meticulous people who were threatened with torture if they missed a stitch. Sector 4 output, 400 units day, the log read. If a volunteer missed their quota, they were sent to the quiet room. Miller found the room at the back of the facility. It was a converted industrial freezer, soundproofed, pitch black. The temperature was kept just above freezing. Victims were thrown in there for 48 hours without light or human contact. When they came out, they would do anything to avoid going back. They would sew until their fingers bled. They would smile for the fake cameras until their faces ached. Back on the factory floor, the paramedics were triaging the victims. Many were suffering from severe vitamin D deficiency, malnutrition, and repetitive strain injuries. But the psychological damage was far worse. A young man named Jason, who had been in Peru for 4 years, refused to let go of a half-finished leather satchel. "I have to finish it," he kept muttering, rocking back and forth. "It's media day tomorrow. Mom needs to know I'm okay." Agent Miller knelt beside him. "Jason, look at me. Madeline is in handcuffs. The cameras are off. You're going home to your real mom." Jason looked at Miller, his eyes adjusting to the concept of freedom like a diver surfacing too fast. Is she still proud of me?" The cruelty of Madeline St. James wasn't just physical. She had weaponized their empathy. She had turned their desire to be good people into a chain that bound them. The raid uncovered more than just the studio. In Madeline's private safe, hidden behind a portrait of herself receiving a humanitarian award, agents found the ledger. It was a list of buyers, boutique owners in Manhattan, online resellers with millions of followers, even a supply manager for a legitimate department store chain. They bought the goods for pennies on the dollar, no questions asked. They didn't know, or didn't care, that the Italian leather was stitched by a kidnapping victim in Chicago. As the 80 volunteers were led out of the warehouse and into the convoy of waiting ambulances, the sun was rising over the industrial district. For the first time in years, the light hitting their faces wasn't a studio lamp. It was real. But for Agent Miller, the case wasn't closed. The sheer scale of the operation, the fake passports, the airport transfers, the distribution network, meant Madeline had help. Powerful help. And one name in the ledger stood out. A name connected to the city's political machine. Someone had protected the Saint of Chicago. Someone had ensured that no health inspector or zoning official ever looked inside Warehouse 4. Miller walked out of the server room, hard drive in hand. "Pack it all up," he ordered his team. "We're going to tear this city's administration apart until we find everyone who signed off on this." The volunteers were safe, but the network that enslaved them was still out there. And Madeline St. James was about to find out that her good deeds had run out of credit. The arrest of Madeline St. James didn't result in immediate condemnation. It resulted in a civil war of public opinion. Within hours of the raid, the Save St. James movement began trending on social media. To millions of Americans, she was the woman who had built hospitals in Sudan and schools in Laos. The idea that she was a slave driver running a sweatshop in Chicago seemed impossible, a grotesque fabrication by the federal government. Her defense team, led by Anthony the Shark Rossi, a lawyer who cost $1,500 an hour, leaned into this narrative. On the steps of the courthouse, after posting Madeline's $5 million bail, paid by a mysterious anonymous donor, Rossi delivered a masterclass in gaslighting. "The FBI has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the St. James Foundation," Rossi told the cameras. "This facility was not a prison. It was a high-security vocational rehabilitation center for at-risk youth. The cages described by the government were secure dormitories designed to protect these young people from their own addictions and bad influences. Mrs. St. James is not a criminal. She is a mother figure to the forgotten." It was a lie so bold it nearly worked. The public wanted to believe in the saint. They didn't want to believe that the donations they had sent for 10 years had funded a house of horrors. But Agent David Miller wasn't watching the news. He was sitting in an interview room with Lisa, the young woman who had hidden the note in the shoe. Lisa was safe now, reunited with her parents, but she was still terrified. She flinched at the sound of the door opening. "Lisa," Miller said gently, sliding a list across the table. We found 80 people in the warehouse, but the recruitment records from the server show that 94 volunteers entered the program over the last decade. Where are the other 14? Lisa went pale. She began to pick at the skin around her fingernails. A nervous tic developed over years of forced labor. "You checked the dorms?" she whispered. "We checked everywhere," Miller said. "Did you check the heating plant?" A chill went down Miller's spine. "The heating plant? You mean the boiler room?" "We called it the chimney," Lisa said, tears welling up. "When someone got too sick to work, or when the quiet room didn't break them. Madeline would say they were being transferred to the overseas branch early, but they never packed their bags. And that night, the building would always get very hot. And the smell?" She covered her mouth, unable to finish. Miller left the room and called the forensic evidence response team. "Get the cadaver dogs back to the warehouse," he ordered, "and bring jackhammers. We're going to the basement." While Miller hunted for the dead, the financial investigation was uncovering the rot among the living. The ledger, found in Madeline's safe, contained a recurring monthly payment of $15,000, labeled simply as consulting fees, City Hall. The payments traced back to a shell company owned by the wife of City Councilman Robert Hatcher. Hatcher was the head of the Zoning and Safety Committee. He was the man who ensured that Warehouse 4 was never inspected by the fire department, never visited by OSHA, and never flagged for zoning violations despite consuming enough electricity to power a small town. Miller brought Hatcher in. The councilman was arrogant, a man used to making problems disappear. "You're fishing, Agent," Hatcher scoffed. "My wife is a legitimate consultant. I have no idea what went on in that building." Miller placed a photo on the table. It wasn't a photo of the money. It was a photo of the cages. "You signed the safety waiver for the industrial modification of the basement," Miller said. "You knew. You took $15,000 a month to let her keep human beings in boxes. When the bodies are found, and we will find them, you won't just be looking at corruption charges. You'll be looking at accessory to murder." Hatcher's arrogance evaporated. He started talking. He told Miller about the special orders Madeline made for him. Custom suits, watches, gifts for his mistresses, all made by the slaves he helped hide. Back at the warehouse, the search had moved to the sub-basement. It was a dark, cramped space housing the building's massive industrial incinerator, used ostensibly for burning packing waste and cardboard. The cadaver dogs went wild the moment they entered the room. The forensic team opened the incinerator. It had been scrubbed clean. Chemicals had been used to bleach the interior. But Madeline had made a mistake. She was frugal. She didn't replace the filters in the smokestack often enough. Technicians removed the heavy soot filters from the chimney. They didn't find cardboard ash. They found bone fragments, teeth, and a melted piece of metal that looked like a surgical pin from a healed fracture. The lab analysis came back 6 hours later. DNA was recovered from the teeth. It matched Marcus Thorne, a 23-year-old volunteer who had left for Cambodia in 2017. It matched Sarah Jenkins, a 19-year-old who went to Peru in 2019. The chimney wasn't for trash. It was a crematorium. When Agent Miller received the call confirming the DNA match, he was watching Madeline St. James give a press conference on live TV. She was standing at a podium, looking small and frail, wiping a tear from her eye. "I have been persecuted," she was saying, her voice wavering perfectly. "I have given my life to the children. These accusations are the work of enemies who hate the light." Miller turned to his partner. "Let's go," he said. "We're revoking her bail." The arrest team caught up with Madeline just as she was leaving the press conference. This time, there was no polite knock on the door. Agent Miller walked onto the stage, right in front of the rolling cameras. The Save St. James supporters in the crowd gasped. "Madeline St. James!" Miller shouted, his voice cutting through the applause. You are under arrest for 14 counts of first-degree murder." The crowd fell dead silent. The saint dropped her act. For a split second, the cameras caught the real Madeleine, her eyes flashing with a predatory, reptilian rage. "You have no proof," she hissed, pulling away from the handcuffs. "We found Marcus," Miller said, close enough for the microphone to catch it. "We found his teeth in your furnace, Madeleine." The shockwave hit the room. The reporters stopped typing. The supporters lowered their signs. The image of the kindly grandmother dissolved, replaced by the monster who burned children to save on overhead costs. As she was dragged away, screaming obscenities that would make a sailor blush, the narrative finally broke. The Saint of Chicago was dead. The Butcher of Warehouse 4 was born. But the investigation wasn't over. The 14 murders were the end of the line for the victims, but for the survivors, the 80 young people who had lived in terror of the chimney, the nightmare was far from resolved. They had to testify. They had to look the woman who had enslaved them in the eye and tell the world what happened in the studio and the quiet room. And Madeleine had one card left to play. She wasn't insane. She was calculated. And she had kept detailed records of everyone who had bought her blood products. If she was going down, she was going to take the entire luxury counterfeit industry with her. The trial of Madeleine St. James began 6 months later in the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago. It was the most attended legal proceeding in the city's history since Al Capone. The Save St. James signs had vanished, replaced by angry mobs demanding the death penalty. The revelation of the chimney had turned the public's adoration into a hatred so pure it was palpable in the air. Inside courtroom 702, Madeleine sat at the defense table. The expensive gray suits and pearl necklaces were gone. She wore a standard orange federal jumpsuit. Her hair, usually dyed a soft chestnut, had grown out into a stark, brittle white. Without her makeup and her grandmother costume, she looked exactly like what she was, a cold, hard woman who had spent a lifetime exploiting others. Her lawyer, Anthony Rossi, attempted a diminished capacity defense. He argued that Madeleine was 68 years old, suffering from early onset dementia, and that the real mastermind was the warehouse foreman who had conveniently fled the country. "This woman is a philanthropist," Rossi argued, sweating under the glare of the jury. "She didn't know the basement was being used for disposal. She signed papers she didn't understand." It was a desperate play, and it crumbled the moment the prosecution played Audio Exhibit 4B. It was a recording from the bugged office of Councilman Hatcher, captured by the FBI 3 weeks before the raid. On the tape, Madeleine's voice was sharp, lucid, and terrifying. "The girl in container 12 is coughing blood, Bob," she said on the recording. "She's slowing down the line. I'm going to have the foreman process her tonight. Make sure the smoke scrubbers are working. I don't want another noise complaint from the neighbors." The courtroom went dead silent. Jurors covered their mouths. There was no dementia in that voice, only the cold calculus of a factory owner discarding a broken tool. But the most devastating moment came when Lisa took the stand. The young woman, whose note in the shoe had saved 80 lives, walked to the witness box. She refused to look at Madeleine. She fixed her eyes on the American flag behind the judge's bench. "Describe the quiet room for the jury," the prosecutor asked. Lisa took a deep breath. "It was cold," she said, her voice trembling but clear. But the cold wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Madeleine would come to the door. She wouldn't open it. She would just whisper through the vent. She would tell us that our parents had forgotten us. She would tell us that she had received emails saying they didn't want us back. She made us feel like the cage was the only place we belonged. "And the chimney?" the prosecutor asked. Lisa began to cry. "We knew when the incinerator was running," she said. "The vents, they vibrated. And the smell. It smelled like like burnt pork. We would sit in our bunks and count the empty beds. We knew who was gone. We just prayed we weren't next. Madeleine St. James did not look at Lisa. She stared at the table, doodling on a legal pad. She looked bored. The evidence against the accomplices was equally damning. Councilman Robert Hatcher, hoping for a reduced sentence, turned state's evidence. He detailed every bribe, every zoning violation he had ignored, every time he had tipped Madeleine off about a potential inspection. She owned the district, Hatcher testified, his career in ashes. She told me that if I ever tried to inspect the basement, she would leak photos of me with an underage girl she had procured for a party. I was trapped. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On a Tuesday afternoon, they returned with the verdict. Madeleine St. James stood up. She didn't tremble. She looked at the foreman with a sneer of contempt. "We find the defendant, Madeleine St. James, guilty," the foreman read. Guilty on 14 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty on 80 counts of human trafficking. Guilty on 94 counts of slavery and forced labor. Guilty on racketeering, fraud, and money laundering. The judge, a veteran named Justice William Thorne, looked at Madeleine with a disgust that broke judicial protocol. "Miss St. James," he said, "you draped yourself in the flag of charity. You used the goodness of young people, their desire to help the world, as a weapon against them. You are not a saint. You are a predator of the highest order. I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 1 400 years. You will die in prison. And may God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none." Madeleine finally spoke. She leaned into the microphone, her eyes scanning the weeping families in the gallery. "I gave them discipline," she spat, her voice venomous. "They were spoiled, useless brats. I taught them how to work. I taught them the value of $1. You should be thanking me." She was dragged out of the courtroom by 4 marshals, still screaming that she was a martyr. The fallout was immediate. Councilman Hatcher was sentenced to 25 years for corruption and accessory to trafficking. The ledger was released to the public. A boutique owner in Soho, who had knowingly bought thousands of the slave-made handbags, was arrested and her business seized. Influencers who had promoted the St. James Foundation, claiming to have visited the schools in Africa, while actually just visiting the Chicago studio, faced fraud charges and career annihilation. But the most significant victory happened quietly, outside the courthouse. Lisa walked out into the sunlight. Her parents were holding her hands. A crowd of reporters was waiting, but Lisa didn't stop to talk to them. She stopped at a trash can. She took off the shoes she was wearing, a pair of the expensive sneakers she had been forced to sew in the factory. She threw them into the trash. Then she put on a pair of cheap flip-flops her mother had brought her. She smiled. "Let's go home," she said. The saint was locked away. The factory was closed. But the story wasn't over. There was still the matter of the $400 million Madeleine had stolen, and what the survivors would do with the blood money that was about to be returned to them. The Warehouse 4 facility in Chicago did not survive long after the verdict. The stigma of the chimney and the quiet room made the property unsellable. No developer wanted to build condos on ground where 14 young people had been incinerated. 2 years after the raid, the city ordered its demolition. It took 3 weeks to tear down the empire of Madeleine St. James. When the wrecking ball finally smashed through the false wall of the studio, the place where Lisa had filmed her fake videos from Kenya, the local residents cheered. The concrete foundation, stained with the memories of slavery, was dug up and hauled away to a hazardous waste landfill. Madeleine St. James did not witness the destruction of her kingdom. She was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. Her life as inmate 9989402 was a stark contrast to her life as the saint. Prison is a hierarchy, and crimes against children and young people are at the bottom. Madeline, who was used to being worshipped, found herself ostracized. She tried to organize prayer groups in the cafeteria, attempting to manipulate fellow inmates with her old grandmotherly act. It didn't work. The other prisoners knew what she had done. They spat in her food. They stole her commissary. She spent her final years in protective custody, essentially solitary confinement, writing letters to the Nobel Committee claiming she was a political prisoner. None were answered. She died in 2031 of pneumonia, alone in the prison infirmary. Her family refused to claim the body. The woman who wanted the world to love her was buried in an unmarked grave, paid for by the state. But while the monster withered, the survivors bloomed. The asset forfeiture of the St. James Foundation was historic. The FBI seized Madeline's offshore accounts in the Caymans, her properties in Aspen and Paris, and the hidden stockpiles of cash from her counterfeit ring. The total recovery was $380 million. It was divided among the 80 survivors and the families of the 14 murdered volunteers. Each survivor received roughly $4.5 million. It was blood money, as Jason, the young man who had been forced to sew satchels, called it. But it bought them therapy. It bought them houses with big windows. It bought them the freedom Madeline had stolen. Jason used his settlement to open a legitimate leatherworking studio. He hired at-risk youth, paid them union wages, and taught them the craft properly, without fear or quotas. He named his company Freehand. "She tried to ruin this for me," Jason said in an interview. "She tried to make me hate the work. But I wouldn't let her take that, too." And Lisa, the girl who put the note in the shoe, didn't retreat from the world. She used her money to establish the 14 Angels Network, named after the volunteers who didn't make it out. The organization is dedicated to vetting volunteer programs. They send investigators to check if schools in Africa are actually being built. They track IP addresses of volunteers to ensure they aren't being routed through VPNs. Lisa became the watchdog that the FBI didn't have the resources to be. 5 years after her rescue, her tip line led authorities to a similar scam operation in Texas, saving 30 teenagers before they could be trafficked. "Madeline taught me how to spot a lie," Lisa told a graduating class of social workers. "She taught me that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a nice old lady with a pearl necklace. And now, I make sure no one else falls for the costume." The site of the Chicago warehouse is no longer a scar on the city. The land was purchased by the survivors using a portion of their settlement. They turned it into a community park. In the center, where the chimney once stood, there is now a fountain. Surrounding the fountain are 14 cherry blossom trees, one for each life lost to the incinerator. Every spring, the trees bloom pink and white, a burst of life in the industrial gray of the district. Underneath the trees, there is a stone plaque. It doesn't mention Madeline St. James. Her name has been erased from the history of this place. The plaque reads, "To those who wanted to heal the world and gave everything, we are the witnesses. We are the proof. The work continues." The story of the St. James Foundation changed the way America looks at charity. The Transparency in Voluntarism Act, passed largely due to Lisa's testimony, now requires strict audits of any nonprofit sending minors overseas. The recruitment posters in coffee shops are scrutinized. The gap year programs are vetted. The blind trust is gone, replaced by necessary vigilance. It was a hard lesson, bought with years of suffering. But as the sun sets over the memorial park and children play near the fountain where cages once stood, the legacy of the 80 survivors is clear. Madeline St. James faked goodness for profit. The volunteers were the real thing. They walked through the fire, and they came out the other side not as victims, but as warriors. The darkness tried to consume them. It failed. And in the end, The only thing Madeleine St. James successfully manufactured was the very army that destroyed her.